As we close out the year, we're resurfacing a small handful of conversations from the TP&R archive that best reflect what this show exists to do: create space for thoughtful disagreement, moral seriousness, and the hard work of living together in a pluralistic democracy, and hopefully having some fun in the process. Thank you to Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible, and to our good friends at the Village Square for being such wonderful supporters of this program. Whether this is your first time hearing this conversation or you're returning to it, I'm really glad you're here. Now let's get right to it. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. As always, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app, and then do the same on your second and third favorite podcast apps. But seriously, all this helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with E.J. Dionne. E.J. Dionne Jr. is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a professor at Georgetown University, and a prolific author of many of my favorite books, such as Sold Out: Reclaiming Faith in Politics After the Religious Right, Our Divided Political Heart, Why the Right Went Wrong. He's, like I said, prolific. You might recognize EJ from his appearances on PBS NewsHour, NPR, MSNBC, and other outlets. But perhaps most notably, he was a diehard Red Sox fan way before 2004, having suffered so many hard 67, 75, and of course 1986 to my beloved New York Mets. EJ Dionne, it's so great to have you. Thanks for coming in.
Love that last point, and I also thank you for listing all the books. I am also an equally fanatical Boston Celtics fan, and so I'm in a very good mood at the moment.
Oh, for heaven's sake. Well, the Knicks are, I do not, if the Knicks make it to the second round, I'm sure they're going up against the Celtics, and I cannot see how we're coming out of the second round against your Celtics.
Hope you're right. I think that's right, but I never want to overhope on sports, having been a Red Sox fan all those years before they won. Our son likes to say how he blessedly followed his dad as a Boston fan, and he has had the best Boston sports life.
He's ruined.
No, that's what he jokes that he is. Although I ascribe all our tribes to him. So because ever since he's been rooting for my teams, they've done remarkably well.
Oh, maybe he's the good luck charm. So it's something on a more serious note. I've seen you practice this art that I've really appreciated of articulating others' positions more fully and fairly than we've come to be used to. The nut picking and these types of arguments that we've come to expect. And then recently I was listening to you tell a story about your dad. And I was wondering if, I don't know if he went by EJ Sr., but I was wondering if he was the one who instilled this virtue in you.
Don't always do it right. I think you're giving me more credit than I deserve, but I do try. I think it's always best in an argument to be answering the best argument that you are disagreeing with rather than some cheap version of it. I'm grateful you asked me about my dad. I grew up in a conservative household, my dad and I love to talk about politics. And I started moving in a different direction when I was about 13 years old. And it continued through my teen years. And my dad was an incredibly open-minded and also very warm person. And he encouraged me to argue with him. He didn't sort of demand that I bow to whatever his views were. He thought argument was a good thing. And when I was 13 years old, he gave me I asked for it, and he gave me a subscription to the New Republic because he thought it would strengthen my side in the argument. And more generally, I grew up in a very diverse extended family. We argued politics all the time. And what that taught me were a couple of things. One, is that you can really disagree with people you love, and you can love people you disagree with. And that's really important and doesn't happen very much. And two, that argument is useful. You learn real things in argument. One of my favorite essays is Christopher Lash's essay, The Lost Art of Argument, where Lash talks about how in authentic argument, you enter imaginatively into the ideas that your opponent holds, if only initially because you're trying to refute them. But in the process, you put your own ideas at risk because you're seriously entertaining what they are saying and listening to how they are making their case. And so Lash has a great line in that essay where he says that, if argument is key to education, then democracy should be, if not always the most efficient, then the most educational form of politics. And real argument in politics, as opposed to competing, screaming at different volume levels,
Right.
should be educational in that way. And unfortunately, our democracy and all of us fail at some points, but the democracy as a whole is not holding up to that side of its obligation.
I'm wondering, in that spirit, there was a book that came out about a year and a half ago, The Identity Trap by Yascha Mounk. And one of the things I really appreciated about that book is he states a fair argument with the people he is critiquing, with some of the scholars, Ibram X. Kendi, the 1619 Project, and tries to do a thorough review of them before engaging with them. I was curious if some of the excesses, I forget exactly what it was that you said in 2016, but you were sort of anticipating the need for what's now just dismissively referred to as woke or DEI or what have you. I'm wondering if you started to rethink some of the excesses of the folks who have been prominent in pushing forward some of these ideas. Have you started to rethink any of that?
Per se, Yascha is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. He is a fascinating person, both to talk with and occasionally to argue with. I put it this way. In some ways, I describe myself for a while as anti-woke, uh, by which I meant that, are there critiques of what passes under that label that are legitimate? Sure, there are. Do people, are there excesses? Yeah. Do we need to be very careful about calling out things as racist when they may not be exactly racist, or they may be simply conservative or right wing? Yes, I agree with all that. But I was by the anti-woke stuff because I thought that the people who go under that label, whether woke or DEI, really were calling our attention to real injustices. And I got to say, looking at what the Trump administration is doing, its war on DEI isn't a war on excesses. It looks to me like a war on the advances we made starting in during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Taking down historical references to Black people who served their country in war or made enormous contributions. I think that that right now the excesses are on that side. So yeah, I think there is a general revisiting of sort of the DEI movement and saying, what didn't work here, or what needlessly created opposition to the broader project, which was racial justice in the country. And so, yeah, I'm thinking about this in terms of tactics, in terms of how it approaches others, in terms of conversion. There's a great essay many years ago written about Martin Luther King, who, by the way, was much more militant than many and now ascribe to him. He could be very tough. Read Letter from Birmingham Jail and his treatment of people who were evading their obligations under civil rights. But this essay argued that one of the things King always kept in mind was the possibility of conversion of adversaries. And no matter who he was talking about, including, a racist sheriff who was beating demonstrators over the head, he always sought the conversion of adversaries. And so I guess, Mark Shields, the great political writer, alas, no longer with us, once said that political world, like the religious world, is often divided between those who hunt for heretics and those who search for converts. And I have a bias toward convert seekers. And so I think we got to try to figure out how to put it on the line about racial injustice and say this is unacceptable in ways that bring more and more people to that side of the argument.
I'm wondering if the actions of the Trump administration are doing more to to help with the conversion of adversaries, as you were as you put it, than some of the I don't know, not broken, but there doesn't seem to be a cohesiveness to the resistance, at least at this point, to Trump 2.0. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think I have a higher view of the resistance, higher in the sense that I think it's more effective than it's given credit for. There was a study done about a month and a half into Trump that showed there were twice as many demonstrations in the country of
Oh,
various kinds
okay. Yeah.
against Trump. I think that the anti-Trump movement has learned a lot from the Tea Party. When you look at both what happened in town halls and then when Republican members of Congress stopped having them, all these Democrats going all over the country organizing town halls in those districts where Republicans won't have them. I think this is a more grassroots from the outset. The old Trump resistance back then did have a lot of grassroots activity. Theda Skocpol, my friend, the Harvard professor, who's done great work on both the Tea Party and the anti-Trump movement, talked about 2,000 or 3,000 groups ultimately that were organized all over the country out of the anti-Trump resistance. But I think that local action has started earlier. The other thing that should be acknowledged is Trump came at everybody a lot faster and more furiously with so many actions that it took a while for people to catch their breath and say, what do we do about this? How do we go after so many targets at the same time? So many things that we see as wrong, deeply wrong, unconstitutional, dangerous, violative of civil liberties. How do you sort of go after all of that? And so I think what I thought you were going to ask is Trump a vehicle for bringing people together who might not have been brought together before this last election? And, for example, I think that on a variety of cultural issues, Trump has moved so far to an extreme side of the argument that I think people with more moderate views and more progressive views are coming together and saying, we may not agree on everything, but we really do agree that you can't send people off to a Salvadoran prison without due process. We can agree that we may have had arguments about DEI, but some of what they're doing, a lot of what they're doing is just pushing back against all civil rights gains. We can agree to oppose that. And so I think Trump, as he did in the first administration, is starting to bring people together across certain disagreements to say, we got to defeat this, and then we can have some other arguments with each other later on.
This podcast is brought to you by Village Squarecast, the podcast your mother warned you about. It takes topics you're not supposed to discuss in polite company, politics, religion, and race, in conversations between people who don't look or think alike, with respect, friendship, and even laughter. So you can see why I love this organization and what they're all about. Over almost 2 decades, the Village Square has hosted hundreds of gatherings with tens of thousands of people in bars and churches and even in the middle of a downtown street. If you've been listening to this program, you probably recognize the name and would be familiar with my dear friend, Liz Joyner, the founder and president of Village Square. On their podcast, Village Squarecast, you get to listen in on these events and all the great conversations they've been having. They're doing it the right way. They really are. So check it out on Village Squarecast, wherever you get your podcasts, and check out their website at villagesquare.us. That's villagesquare.us. While you're there, you could sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening there. That's villagesquare.us for the website where you can sign up for the newsletter and Village Squarecast and all the podcast apps. You know, I guess I'm still, I don't know if cynical is the right word, but cautiously pessimistic, at least since January 6th, 2021. The way you put it you summarized it really well in one of your pieces in early February in the Post. You said, if our constitutional democracy doesn't matter, I don't know what does. And what I've been dismayed at, this is me talking now, not quoting you. What I've been dismayed at since at least the night of January 6, 2021, is apparently it does not matter. You know, and this last election, I thought that, our Bill of Rights, the rights that are articulated just in the First Amendment matter. But at the end of the day, it was the price of eggs. At the end of the day, it was those ads that they were running in Wisconsin about transgender athletes worked a lot more, concerned people a lot more than the idea of these very concrete attacks on the freedom of press, on our rights to free speech and free assembly and rights to be represented, a redress of grievances. There's should I be hopeful? should I have more faith in our institutions than what it looks like is happening right now?
The form of warning and accountability, I always like to say to people that a dear friend of mine many years ago accused me of being a feliciopath. Which is essentially seeing grounds for hope or optimism when there were absolutely no grounds at all. And there are some days when I think of John McCain's great old line that things always get dark before they go completely black. And I try to keep that in the back of my head.
Yeah.
So I share some of your worries and gloominess. But I also think, and that trans ad, by the way, my hometown is a great old mill town in Massachusetts called Fall River. And it was an old New Deal Catholic Roosevelt town. It's voted 75% Democratic right through recent years, Gore and Obama and Kerry. It voted Republican for president for the first time in 100 years this year. And what it brought home to me, I went up and wrote a piece about my hometown, is how much anger there is in communities particularly communities where you once had a high level of unionized working class jobs, where you both had jobs that paid at least a living wage and unions that affected the political culture of the town. Now those jobs are gone, the unions are weaker, but what you got is this long-term anger about what's happened to us. And somebody up there about those trans ads told me, look, there are, some people here are pretty conservative on trans issues, maybe uncomfortable with it. But the real issue for them was the kicker in that ad, which was she's for they, them, he's for you. And I think for what this person argued is for a lot of those folks, Trump made it look like with those ads that Kamala Harris was running for president on trans issues. A lot of people thought that. And so the message Trump sent, not really subliminally, but rather directly, is she's not thinking about you, the working class person, whether white, black, or Latino. She's thinking about these cultural issues. And so I think that is some of it. It's not, it's not necessarily that, most people want to treat trans people with sort of decency and respect. They don't like meanness. The polling is complicated on that. There are some fair number of older people, especially, are uncomfortable with the whole trans question. And unlike gays or lesbians, almost everybody knows someone who's gay or lesbian. Not many Americans know someone who's trans. And the fact that people knew someone gay or lesbian, somebody dear to them, really help revolutionize attitudes on same-sex marriage and a lot of other issues. That's going to take a whole lot longer with trans people simply because of the numbers. But I think it's this question of Trump using a lot of issues to make the case that he is fighting for you, this person with grievances. I think the other thing that happened, and you probably ran into this, I certainly did when I was doing traveling during the election. There were a lot of people who just took the view, oh, Trump can't be that bad.
Right.
Trump won wasn't that bad. There was the pandemic, but these things didn't happen. He says a lot of things he doesn't mean. And I've joked that lying in a consistent way turns out to be a real asset to Trump because the phrase I used is people can have Trump a la carte. They decide that he really means the thing they agree with, and that other stuff he's just kind of lying about. And those of us who oppose Trump said, no, 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 this stuff about democracy, about liberty, about presidential power, his nice things he says about dictators abroad, this is a real part of him. But I think that we didn't succeed in making that argument effectively enough, partly because I think that we didn't fully grapple with the anger that was out in parts of the country about some long-term changes in people's lives that left them in a mood to roll the dice and vote for a guy, even when they told pollsters they didn't really like him.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of work to do on both sides. I think since the first 100-day polling shows that an awful lot of those people who voted for him have second thoughts about him. Real sharp movement against him among independents. Really sharp movement against him among Latinos. So I think people are having second thoughts. And people who voted for him to take a chance, many of them wish they hadn't. But I understand, when I go to my hometown, these are people I love and grew up with. I understand why people were angry. And I sort of empathize with some of that anger and wish those of us who oppose Trump had found better ways of answering that anger.
I want to ask you the other side of that question, and that is there's a very broad cult. I call it the pro-democracy coalition, generally speaking, from Liz Cheney to AOC. And naturally, there's so much discussion and examination of what went wrong in 2024, but we might overlook that there was a lot for that pro-democracy coalition that went right in 2018, 2020, and even 2022. What do you think is a path forward that reckons with, listen, we got some of these things really wrong in 2024, but how can we combine what went right in those, the midterms in 18 and 22, as well as the 2020 election?
I think that's a really good question that I want to get to. I just want to make note that we shouldn't treat 2024 as a landslide, even though Trump says it was.
No, that's
This
fair.
was a very close, a point and a half. We were, it's treated even by Trump's opponents as a landslide because they were so shocked he won the popular vote at all. But he got less than 50% of the popular vote. The popular vote margin nationwide was about a point and a half. Where she waged the toughest campaign, which are in the 6 swing states, Harris did actually better than average in those states. Now, she didn't win them, and she lost ground in most of, I think something close to 90% of the counties on the Biden vote. But this was a very close election, and you saw some shifts in the Democrats' favor, partly because of that democracy coalition that you were talking about. Outside of the Philadelphia area, for example, a pollster pointed this out to me. Harris ran a couple points ahead of Biden in the rest of the counties in the state. So there was some shifting around. So there was something to that democracy coalition. What was missing, I think, is that there was much hope given to the possibility of that democracy coalition to convert a few more Republicans and Republican-leaning independents than turned out to be possible. And what was lost was turnout in some of the big city. Turnout went down. Some of a black turnout in some places went down, and the working class vote. And that if you could have had some of Biden's margins among working class voters, some of the turnout that Biden got in 2020, then that coalition would have worked. And so to me, the lesson is you don't break the democracy alliance up. You don't give up on that. You need that coalition. But that is not quite enough if there is that much anger floating around among lower middle, working class voters. And if you don't realize that all elections are a combination of mobilization and turnout. Trump put a lot of emphasis on turnout. He knew he couldn't go much higher than he was, and he increased his turnout in a lot of places. And I think that you needed more emphasis on turnout and more emphasis on winning back some of the working class voters who began fleeing in 2016.
Yeah. I like to ask
She had been
this.
fleeing earlier, but 2016 was a real break point.
Right, right. Who says you can't talk about religion? Pew Research Center's Religious Landscape Study has been doing just that at scale for nearly 20 years. With responses from over 35,000 Americans across all 50 states, the Religious Landscape Study is a comprehensive look at faith, beliefs, and identity in our lives and our country. It's the largest single survey Pew Research Center conducts, aiming to provide authoritative information on the size and characteristics of U.S. religious groups because the U.S. Census Bureau does not collect that information. On the Religious Landscape Studies interactive website, you can find survey data by metro area, state, or region, or for the whole United States. You can also explore the social and political views and demographic traits of U.S. religious groups. I've been using it myself in preparation for a lot of the interviews we do here on TP&R. Pew Research Center conducts high-quality research to inform the public, journalists, and leaders about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping our world. Studying trends in U.S. religion is a key part of the center's long-standing research agenda. To learn more about the Religious Landscape Study and dive into the data, visit pewresearch.org/RLS. That's pewresearch.org/RLS. I'd like to reframe this a little bit. You've talked about the difference between optimism and hope. Could you separate that out for us and help us understand a little bit better?
Sure. And I've been what Barack Obama calls a hope monger for most of my life, and I was very influenced by people who sort of pioneered the theology of hope way back in the 60s, people like Jürgen Moltmann and Johannes Metz, a Lutheran and a Catholic, who wrote a lot about the theology of hope. I once wrote and realized I was picking a fight with St. Paul when I wrote that hope is the virtue on which faith and love depend. And of course, St. Paul taught that love is the primary virtue, which I am willing to concede. But what I argued is that, without hope, faith and love are really, really difficult. Mm-hmm. Now, what I believed for a long time, and Obama actually articulated it quite often, is that optimism is kind of a feeling, and it's just something you mobilize without really analyzing the facts. It's and it's a thing. I like optimistic people. You have to be a Red Sox fan, as long as I was. But hope is actually a virtue for a reason. Hope says, you accept what the evidence is. You know that the evidence may be against the possibility that you will triumph, and you continue anyway. You keep going forward anyway, because you maintain the hope that salvation of a kind is possible down the line. Not the big ass salvation, but
Yeah,
salvation for us down here on Earth. That progress is possible down the line, and so the civil rights movement is a great example of that,
I
where
was
there
just
were
thinking of
enormous
hope
number.
embodied by young people sitting at lunch counters for what's to come next. That
Right, and people getting killed in voter registration drives, and yes, exactly, and then similarly with the labor movement over a long period of time, that so many movements for justice have suffered through very, very difficult periods. And for goodness sake, Jim Crow lasted. Reconstruction ended, with in a kind of sea of terrorism in the South, led by the Ku Klux Klan and others. And it took from 1877 to 1964 before we had the second Reconstruction. And there were a lot of areas of life where if you give up hope, then there's no rationale for acting. You have to have the hope that somewhere down the road, if you do the right thing, reach out to people in the right way, and make the right arguments, organize in an effective way, you can win down the road. And so I think you've got to hold on to hope even when the evidence is really bad. And I think that's the difference between hope, the virtue, and optimism, a feeling.
I forget if it was this morning or yesterday. I came across one of your older, now it's almost 15 years, a piece that you wrote for the New Republic, where you were quoting Isaiah, that you were hopeful that folks from different points of view, you said, quoting Isaiah, "Come, let us
Let's
reason
reason together.
together." Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
now we've devolved in a lot of ways since that time. You were talking about the debate over the Affordable Care Act, and what led up to that, and you were hopeful that we could do this thing. Are you still? Do you still have reason to be hopeful, or have we devolved to a point where that's at the very least a heck of a lot harder?
Just have to acknowledge that personally, I am kind of much harder line about politics than I was 10 or 20 years ago. And I do feel a degree of distance from the other side, the side that disagrees with me, much greater than I felt 20 or 25 years ago, much greater, for example, than I felt when I wrote my book, Why Americans Hate Politics. And I've sort of had been disappointed at various moments. Healthcare, to me, is a perfect example. When you looked, and by the way, my late mom was a librarian, and she loved to throw books out for people to read. Jonathan Cohn's book, the 10 Years War, about the victory of Obamacare. He took it all the way back to Clinton Care. It's a great book about how that came about. And Obama and supporters of Obamacare looked back and said, well, why did Clinton Care lose? Why did Clinton lose this fight? What can we do to move this forward to get more people at least covered by health insurance, even if we can't quite get to universal coverage? And so they took ideas from quite conservative sources. The healthcare exchanges were an idea that came from the Heritage Foundation. And they were trying to create a better healthcare market, and that the combination of effective exchanges with subsidies could help a lot of government subsidies, could help a lot of people get health insurance. It was essentially what Mitt Romney did when he passed something close to universal health care up in Massachusetts. And yet, this effort to take Republican ideas, or ideas that were more acceptable to the conservative side, more market oriented than a progressive might normally be. It wasn't single payer, for which he was criticized from the left. These efforts should have rallied a much larger coalition to support what he was trying to do, because a lot of conservatives in their heart of hearts know that it is just not right that someone whose kid is sick can't go see the doctor without paying a lot of money because they don't have any health insurance. I thought about this issue a lot when our kids were little, and we could get on the phone, go down the street, go see the doctor, And, it was probably something minor, but it kept it from going to being something more serious. And we didn't go, it was pretty serious to us as parents when our
Sure.
kids were sick. And not to have that ability is just a scandal. And so on that issue and on so many others, I've been disappointed. And then the other thing is, on the side of the Republican Party, I joke with people that my dirty little secret is that I was a teenage liberal Republican. And that's a dirty little secret because I can't think of anything more boring to be as a teenager than a liberal Republican. And I passed through liberal Republicanism on the way to where I am now. But you had back at that time an awful lot of Republicans who were trying to think creatively, say during the Great Society. Well, Johnson wants to do this. What ideas can we come up with that might be more market oriented? Or have a little less government that might start solving some of the same problems. Liberal Republicans are gone entirely, and moderate Republicans are a truly endangered species. And, a lot of my conservative friends, people I known for a long time, argued politics with for a long time, almost to a person, the people I was closest to, people like the late Mike Gerson or Pete Wehner or Bill Kristol, almost all of them became anti-Trump Republicans because the Republican Party, with darn few exceptions among elected officials, have still been too timid to take Trump on. And I understand people don't want to lose office and they don't want to lose primaries, but so much of what Trump has done is it got to be antithetical to what so many of these folks have always either believed or said they believe, but I take them at their word that they always did believe. And I find that, really, really troublesome. And I hope that, Trump declining in the polls and some of the obvious failures you're seeing, the backlash against the tariffs might give some Republicans a little more heart to say, okay, this is not all working right. For goodness sake, sending somebody to a prison in another country without due process, if there's not a good libertarian conservative issue in that, I don't know what is a good conservative libertarian issue than trying to defend Mr. Abrego Garcia.
Yeah, yeah. As we watch the market bounce and keep on finding trying to find its bottom, I think there's a parallel to be made about the principles of the Republican Party. Frankly, at what point does that party find its true resistance point? Or as someone put it. I forget who it was that I was listening to it was the reporting that I think it was Ashley Parker just did for The Atlantic in her interview with President Trump. He has this knack for bending reality to his will. And I see it in so many of my friends that, all of a sudden, they're sort of regurgitating these talking points as if they've believed it their entire lives. So I wonder at what point we find the trough in terms of political principles.
See, my hope had been that if he had lost this election, the 2024 election, and especially if Republicans had lost the House, which was close, that might be the time when people who really wanted to take this on would have more space. I mean, Nikki Haley got some support in those primaries. There were Republicans out there who consistently were voting for Haley even after she dropped out of the race.
Yeah.
But that was still a minority of the party. But I think more Republicans, if this had led to defeat, would say, okay, now we got to start changing. And Trump shouldn't be taken as a prophet whom we follow on every issue, no matter what we believed in the past. And that just didn't happen. And on the contrary, at least until now, it only strengthened Trump's hold on that party. Look at what Marco Rubio is saying compared to what he said before is a particularly stark lesson in a complete flip. At least people like former Congressman Louis Gohmert, some of those folks actually believe this all along. Okay,
Right.
that's where they were. But there are so many Republicans who talked about the dangers of Trump back in 2016 and are now in a completely different place.
Yeah, no, your friend Will Salatan, I know you go to the Faith Angle Forum together, wrote that incredible character study of Lindsey Graham that came out a couple of years ago, that watches again devolution, if you will. Yeah, I want to switch gears for a second though. I've heard you say that you're a cradle Catholic.
Right.
I was wondering when did you begin to reckon with your own faith? You were born into the Catholic Church, but when did you begin to reckon with what you actually believe?
No, I think it probably started really early. I've taught classes related to religion and politics for many years, and I always tell students that I teach this class in part because in our family we violated the core rule of what you do at dinner, which is that you're not supposed to discuss either religion or politics, and we talked about religion and politics all the time. And the church was really important to us growing up. Our pastors, our priests were some of the best friends of my parents. I went to a Benedictine high school where I was taught by some really truly brilliant men. I went to a Catholic grade school where I was taught by these awesome nuns. I got my first lesson in civil rights from a sixth grade teacher we had, and she had a Southern accent. You don't hear a lot of those in Fall River, Massachusetts. I discovered she'd been kicked out of the South because she organized biracial, racially integrated First Communion service in Louisiana. And, that was really, my town was almost entirely white. That was the first early lesson in what civil rights was. So these folks were important to me. And I guess I've always been haunted by these questions. When I was in college, I went to Harvard, and they allowed students to cross-register finally in the divinity school. And I think a friend and I were the first two to cross-register and take a class as undergrads in the divinity school. And it's my favorite class on my college transcript. It was with the great liberal theologian Harvey Cox, and the class was called Eschatology and Politics.
I love
And
it.
it was an amazing class. So these questions have always been with me. I've struggled with them all my life. And I also joked that maybe I sort of stayed in the church because I went to a secular school, and so the more rebellious thing was to go to church than not to, and so I did the rebellious thing. I don't know. It made it. I think I might have rebelled the other way under other circumstances, but these questions have just always preoccupied me. I've always been interested in theologians. I've always been interested in trying to figure these things out, the mystery of God and the universe. How are we supposed to understand this? I'm a doubting believer. I've always said the people I most respect are humble believers and humble non-believers, and the people I mistrust are arrogant believers and arrogant non-believers. I admire people who struggle with these ultimate questions. I once wrote a column, and I borrowed this headline with attribution from a piece Leon Wieseltier did many, many years ago. The piece was called "God Bless Atheists," and I argued that people who are believers had to give a lot of respect to atheists because they often took the question of God's existence far more seriously than a lot of tepid believers or non-believers do, and forced believers to be serious about, I guess it's St. Paul again, giving an account of the faith that is in them. And I got, if you write a newspaper column, you get a lot of negative mail, and I'm all for it. It's free speech. I'm lucky enough to be able to send my views out there. So if somebody wants to yell back at me, God bless them. My favorite I use this in talks a lot. Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person? And I always say to people in the room, at least you may get nothing out of my talk, but you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. But I got this lovely note from someone that just said, Dear Mr. Dionne, I am an atheist, but if I may say so, God bless you. Uh, And so these questions have been with me and I can't shake them. And rather than shake them, I've embraced them, I guess is the way to put it.
Well, I have to say one of the best arguments for a healthy church to come alongside our democracy was just released by John Roush, an atheist. I don't know if you had a chance to read his book Cross Purposes, but
He's a humble non-believer. In other
humble
words,
non-believer.
he is firm and clear and really smart.
Yeah,
But he has an openness to people of faith that you know very well. You've had him on this show, and
yeah.
he's also fascinated by faith.
He is. He is. So speaking of arrogant believers, I've seen this play out, and I need to ask you about the passing of Pope Francis. What I've seen, I can only think of it. I alluded to it before we hit record, but it's a political idolatry. And what I mean by that is a lot of the accounts about Pope Francis, it's a review of his life and his work according to someone's personal political leanings, right? So, to the degree that Pope Francis either worked in favor of those political leanings or against those political leanings, that's how they're measuring it. So, it's I guess breaking the first commandment: "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." But in a lot of these accounts, they are putting this other set of principles, these other set of priorities, that being politics, over and above what should be our measure, our standard as the people of God, in order to measure this, a servant of God. That's God Himself, or God's word, or God's work. So our politics should be measured against that standard, not the other way around. Does that make it makes sense in my head? I don't know if it's making sense now that it's out of my mouth.
Sort of agree and disagree at the same time.
Okay.
Where I agree is that it is a grave mistake to look at Pope Francis as a politician and not as a person of deep faith.
Yeah.
He wrote one of his most important documents, besides the climate document, of course, was The Joy of the Gospel. And it's very
Mm,
important that every word in that title is important. And, it's like C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy. And it was, in a sense, that sort of argument. He was somebody who, my friend, the teacher, Harvey Cox, used to talk about people's religion. And a lot of religious intellectuals are sort of kind of skeptical of popular sort of expressions of religious faith, whether it's Marian, pilgrimages or all sorts of things. Pope Francis had a lot of respect for people's religion and the kind of faith expressed by rank and file Christians, and he was constantly preaching about. Well, he was a hope guy too, Pope Francis. So I agree with that. That we tend to treat him more as a political figure than as a religious figure. I guess where I disagree is the fact of the matter is that religious people, Christians in this case, Catholics in particular, are deeply divided by political questions right now. And that there is, it's funny. Ross Douthat is someone whom I really respect. I've known and respected Ross since I first started reading him when he was 23 years old. And so we've been in contact. And he once wrote me and said, EJ, you got to take Pope Benedict seriously. And I did. And so when he started criticizing Pope Francis, I wrote him. I can't remember if I told him or I wrote him an email. And I said, look, I listened to you about Pope Benedict. I'd love you to listen to yourself what you told me about Pope Francis. But, and Ross is by no means one of the most ardent of Francis's critics. But, he really did put the climate and social injustice and the ways in which global capitalism can be unfair. He put those at the center of his teaching, and that engendered a political backlash. And so I don't think it should surprise us that there is a political, partially political response. But I agree that people should look at him holistically and remember that he felt himself that his first obligation was to preach the gospel.
yeah. Now, you're someone that not only are you a Catholic, you when you were working for the New York Times, they sent you to travel the world with Pope John Paul. And having had that experience, I can't help but wonder how you're processing the death of Pope Francis, as well as, the issues that the Catholic Church is facing right now.
You may have seen, or I'll share it with you. I wrote a rather laudatory column upon his death
Right.
that I'd been working on before he died, and I feel that there will never be another pope like him, in that not only because of his strong voice on poverty and injustice and migrants and the climate, but he had a way of reaching people, a kind of sense of humor about himself. One of the things I noted in that column that I will always love, and I don't think we'll ever see from a pope again, is he criticized sourpusses. Now, whether that's his sense of humor or one of his translators, I love a guy who criticizes sourpusses. And also just you talk about somebody who walks his talk. He didn't live in the papal apartments. He lived, a consciously humble life. He didn't lord it over everybody that he did. He just did it to live the example. And I don't think we'll see somebody quite like that, and I think that's very sad. Now, the fact is, in terms of the internal church issues, the Pope was left. He opened more questions than he closed, in a way.
Mm,
For example, some of the most famous words that you never expected a Pope ever to say, "Who am I to judge?"
right.
really began to revolutionize it really began to revolutionize the way the church dealt with LGBTQ issues. But he did not choose to change church doctrine on that. Similarly, he insisted that abortion alone could not dominate church teaching. He didn't change church doctrine on that. I don't think the church will change its doctrine on that. Dealing with divorced Catholics, there were a lot of issues dealing, especially with the role of women in the church. There are a lot of issues he opened up, but haven't been settled. And so I think the argument goes on. Massimo Fagioli, I was fiddling with some papers here,
Yeah.
who's a scholar at Villanova, wrote a very good piece in Commonweal where he wrote, if I may quote Massimo, Francis deployed a kind of strategic ambiguity when it came to doctrinal issues, allowing the old order to carry on alongside clear messages about the need for a new pastoral praxis. I think that's a pretty good summary at a practical level of what the Pope was up to. But I think for progressives all over the Christian community, and really all over the religious community, most people do not expect a pope to be as outspoken or as movingly outspoken as he is. So I experienced it as a real loss, and along with a whole lot of other people.
So since we're talking about the church and theology, if you'll indulge me for a second, I have a question about one of my favorite Bible studies, and that is East of Eden. I figured you might be a special person since you're so ensconced in theology and these questions, as well as so well read. Um, if you remember that book, there is this great Bible study on, I forget exactly what verse it is, but it's in Genesis 4. And the part of the verse that they look at is sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, but you must overcome it. A lot of translations have you must overcome it. Some have you shall overcome it. And the question they were grappling with is, what was that word? The ancient Hebrew, what was that word? Was it must? Was it shall? And the characters that Steinbeck uses is these field workers, these Asian field workers, but they were really incredible linguists. And the conclusion that they arrived at was the word is thou mayest overcome it. My question is, I wonder if they took a look at the word that is usually translated as sin, what would that word be? I think we misunderstand. We think, oh, I told a lie, that's a sin, right? I just don't think that's a sufficient word for it. So sin is crouching at the door. You and David Brooks have talked about sin in the past, some conversations I've heard you. So what, if that word was translated more fully or in a more nuanced way, what might that be?
By the way, there are times when I think we should hold on to the word sin, because if we don't, we're kind of evading the sense of responsibility, either personal or social, that implies. And there is personal sin and there is social sin, and that we, all of us, are quite capable of acting in that way. There's a line that Niebuhr used. David and I both love Niebuhr. We once did a whole session with Krista Tippett about Niebuhr, and but why each of us in different ways resonated to him. He used a line which he freely acknowledged he didn't invent. He was not a plagiarist, but he's credited with it. Original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian Church,
That's right.
which I have always loved because it's about the fact that human beings are capable of transcendence, yes, but we are capable of sin, depravity, evil. It's often said that Niebuhr taught liberals about original sin. And I resonate to that because I think it's very important to acknowledge that human beings do have the capacity to transcend and do better. But this part of us is there, and it's a constant struggle for both individuals and societies. So I'm not sure I would replace the word sin, but two observations, if I may. One is I think how you would replace it tells you a lot about your priorities. That some people would use, say, a word like injustice in place of sin, which suggests a certain analysis about the sources of evil in the world. Others might use words like depravity or decay, which suggests other views of how, or indulgence, which suggests other views about how to define sin. I wrote a long time ago that part of the problem with our politics is that it's devolved into an argument over which sins are worse, which sins are more important. And if you are on the progressive side, you tend to talk about racism and sexism and economic injustice. And if you're on the conservative side, you tend to talk about a whole lot of sexual sin and other forms of personal corruption. And I'm not sure that's an ideal way to carry out politics. But I'm not sure what I think that I might be situational in how I replace the word sin, because I think there are, what is it? Who was it who wrote Varieties of Religious Behavior? It was the great William James, I think.
Okay.
Somebody out there will correct me. Maybe the book is Varieties of Sinful Behavior, because it does come in many varieties.
Well, I appreciate the Bible if because the sin happens in chapter 2, and then the rest of the Bible is a redemption project, how God's going about redeeming
I
his
like that.
creation, right? And now I bring that up because I think it might have been in one of the pieces you wrote after the election. Perhaps it was the one where you went back to Fall River, and you were talking about solidarity among family, friends, and neighbors. And I wonder if this, the way Heschel would talk about it, the sanctity in the mundane, right? I wonder if this is the way towards um, some sort of redemption. I don't know. Am I making too big of a thing of something like that?
Talk about redemption. How do you mean it in that way?
Well, I'm thinking of redemption more in the Jewish form of it, tikkun olam, healing the world, and it's not one big thing. It's like these collection of little things that we do, mitzvot, these little things that we do on a daily basis that work towards healing the world, works towards tikkun olam. That's where I think there's a sanctity in sitting with the fellow who from your hometown at a bar in Fall River, and just having a neighborly conversation, right? Even if that fellow voted differently than you did at the top of the ticket, I think there's something, we're doing the work of tikkun olam even in that mundane conversation.
Yeah, I really like that. By the way, I fact checked myself. The William James book is Varieties of Religious Experience, so I don't want to spread fake
Okay.
news. The I really like that idea a lot. I mean, at some level, I'm sure this is wrong, but I kind of think there are no mundane conversations. I think the act of conversation, maybe it's just because I like to talk and I like to listen, but I think that conversation itself about almost anything is instructive to both people on the other side of it, because at some level you learn something about how at the very least, you learn something about how other people think. You learn something about how each of us has our own priorities. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're different, and you can explore why. So I really like that idea, and I do think that um, we I think that there are so many arguments we have that are kind of false choice sort of arguments where, if one argues that there are certain problems you can only solve through policy, there's some truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. You're not going to get everyone health care unless you have a policy designed to do it. You're going to have in any kind of market economy, you're going to have distortions in the way wealth and income are redistributed, and you want to figure out how much should you correct for those distortions. So I believe devoutly in policy, but I do not think you can leave out the role of family and neighborhood and civil society organizations, including faith-based organizations, in helping to heal a society. That if you look at some of the poorest places in America. If you look, for example, at towns in Appalachia that have really been left behind when the coal industry died, or when some other industry died, and people are left behind without income, you also find that they have fewer churches, fewer clubs, fewer institutions that pull people together, partly because the town lacks the wherewithal to support those institutions. And for a lot of our deepest problems, we rely on family and friends and people in churches, or people in the Elks Club, or people in the Rotary, wherever kind of organization we go to. And I think so I'm sort of pro-religion, civil society, progressive, if you want to sort of have a label with a whole bunch of hyphens in it, because I think those kinds of institutions are critical to a good society. And so I want government to solve certain problems, but I want us to nurture these other forms of connectedness that are so important to us in our lives. I'm not sure I may have answered a different question than the one you asked, but that's what you inspired in me.
Well, that's great. No, you did answer it, and it leads me to another question. That instead of asking my typical talking politics and religion without killing each other question, how do we do it, or is it possible? I want to ask you. A lot of folks know about your.
Your show, by the way, our friend John Roush told me about you, and so I was going to do it anyway. But when I saw the title of your show, I said, "Good for you." That people have been asking that question since the 30 Years' War. I mean.
Well, a lot of folks know about your many conversations with David Brooks. Not as many folks know about your conversations with Stanley Carlson Tees. From what I understand, you just did a tribute to him. There was an event. So I'd love to tell us a little bit more about your relationship with him and this event, this tribute that you had.
Thank you for bringing that up. We were talking about it before we started. So Stanley is somebody who, since 1992, has been working on how to nurture partnerships, including partnerships with government, between faith-based institutions and the government, to solve social problems, to serve the neediest people in our country. And that's an issue that's preoccupied me pretty much since the 90s. I did a lot of work on this with my friend John DiIulio, who briefly was head of the faith-based office in the Bush administration, even though he's a Democrat. And John and I actually did a book together in 2000 called What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment, that grew out of some of that work. And also I've done a lot of work on this with Melissa Rogers, who ran the faith-based offices in the second Obama and throughout the Biden administration. And so I have argued with Stanley and worked with Stanley, and I'm probably on the range of positions a little bit of a stricter separationist than Stanley is, but like Melissa, who gave a tribute to Stanley, I really admire his effort to find common ground across a broad divide. And I was filled with a sort of sense of longing. I'd say nostalgia, but I think nostalgia is useless. It's nostalgia I never trust, because all nostalgists only see the lovely parts of the past and never the things that were wrong. But I remembered a time, and there were people all over that room, including many people I disagreed with on politics who worked on faith-based stuff for Bush. These were all people who shared a commitment to finding whatever ways we could to improve society generally and make it particularly make it better for the left out and the left behind. And we could have real discussions that tried to get somewhere. And there was kind of a consensus on the role of faith-based groups that built from Clinton to Bush to Obama and to Biden, that the Trump administration does not seem to be part of. But Stanley is somebody whose work I really respect, even when I disagreed with it, and someone whom I think in his heart was really trying to make the world a fairer and better place. And I wish we could find room for those conversations. It's conversations I've had over the years with people well, like the late Mike Gerson, whom I miss to this day, and Pete Wehner. And he and I had some real fierce disagreements in the Bush years, but we have shared, a lot in common as well. I just have to toss out a line that I shared with you. I was talking to Mike Gerson one day, and he was one of the kindest hearted people, as well as tough-minded people I knew. And I paused and I looked at him and I said, Mike, you're something of a miracle. You are a Christian who actually behaves like a Christian. And then I sort of sat back and said, oh, that's what you think, huh?
Yeah.
But he really was that kind of person.
Yeah. That's great. So, speaking of Mike Gerson, somebody else that you worked with at the Post for, I think, 20 years was Fred Hyatt. He was one of the people that I would have loved to have had on this program. Can you tell us about Fred and, in particular, how much of a difference a good editor makes for not just individual columnists, but for a publication as a whole?
Well, a good editor shapes the mood of a place, including the mood of the employees. A good editor, I think, of an opinion section like the Washington Post, is very skilled at bringing good people together and creating a mood that makes people happy to work together, which I think is important in any workplace, but maybe especially important when dealing with the written word, since those of us who are writers can be a real pain in the neck a lot of the time. Well, I'll tell you a couple of things about Fred that I particularly admired. One was the passionate, consistent commitment to universal human rights. And if you go back and look at everything he wrote about human rights and abuses of human rights and the protection of rights, including, by the way, religious liberties, but all forms of liberty, and taking a look at countries that people weren't paying any attention to where rights were being violated. That was a singularly important part of his commitment. And alongside that, and related to that, was an incredibly strong commitment to democracy. And he is also someone, Fred and I didn't always agree on everything, but he was someone who you could, have a disagreement with, and in the great tradition of good argument, could learn something from and could argue with collegially. And, I worked with him for a long time. And, I thought he showed particular courage, after the rise of Trump, and where he, put all of us, in that fight. And, Fred was a fairly moderate sort of liberal. He was by no means, he was by no means any kind of radical liberal. But boy, was he committed to, democracy, fair processes, due process for people accused of things. And that shone right through the entire period until his death. And it was, I still mourn his death, as many people do.
Yeah. Yeah. I need to, before I start to wrap it up, I really do need to ask you two things. What concerns you the most about where we're at as a country, and what gives you hope?
Right. I mean, I do think that, if you look at what is happening inside our government right now, I think there are fundamental threats to constitutional democracy, due process, and basic civil liberties. And I've already alluded to some of them. There is something deeply wrong about sending people to a foreign prison, period, but doing it without even having any due process. There is something wrong with a regime that is going after all sorts of independent sources of commentary and power, not just journalists, but universities, lawyers, law firms. That this is a concentrated attack on independent institutions. That is very dangerous. And I think the overreach of executive power, which is really wrecking our government. I mean, I have talked to libertarians who would like a smaller government, than I would, but who have said the random ways in which government is being attacked and people are being fired, this is not a reform project. This is a kind of obliteration project, where, there's more concern with reaching a certain number of people fired than of reshaping an agency and getting rid of USAID, getting rid of Voice of America. Talk about weakening our influence in the world, let alone weakening our capacity to do good in the world in the case of USAID. So I am very alarmed by this. What heartens me is, the rest of the country seems to be alarmed by it too. There are now majorities. It didn't take very long for majorities to form saying all this stuff is going too far. For example, Trump won in part because Americans were concerned about the southern border and immigration across the southern border. And if you look at the polling, people still say they support by narrow margins, but by a majority, what Trump is doing at the southern border. Yet they don't approve of his immigration policies overall because they are uncomfortable with this, over civil liberties threatening overreach. And you look at the response to the tariffs, where people said, I was concerned about prices, and that's why I voted for him. But this thing didn't, this is not what I asked for or anticipated. And so the fact that people are coming together, are organizing, and trying to say, we're not going to let this democracy get away from us. Every time people fight back and stand up, it makes it a little less likely that this project will succeed. And I hate to make the most hopeful thing be so closely connected to the first thing, because I'd way more prefer to talk about things people are doing for each other in their neighborhoods, things people are doing for their children, the sort of really nice, the great run of the Boston Celtics. I'd love to talk about something else than that, but I do, because I think the first is such a threat. I think the response is a source for hope.
Yeah.
And so what I would like to ask you, if I could, before
Sure.
we go,
Yeah.
is what animates you at heart in your relationship to the media you're doing and your relationship to public life? What's your motive in doing this show, in doing what you do? I'm really curious.
Two things come to mind. One is going back to 2000, October of 2000, I became a Christian. And a few weeks later, I went back to New Jersey where my parents were still living, and I told my parents, that I became a Christian. It was Thanksgiving morning, and the conversations that we had, and in some ways are still having, um, are definitely an inspiration for doing this project, because we needed to figure out a way to talk about how we do this life thing together. And the currency, the currency of that is politics and religion. And if we don't know how to do it, we're doomed. And then fast forward, uh, I guess it was really heightened in the 2008 campaign, where I was a fan of McCain. The second that Sarah Palin started speaking, and the enthusiasm that a lot of people I was going to church with had for her, really concerned me. I saw signs of it within a couple of years after I became Christian in 2002 and 2003. Um, the there's a political idolatry. I mentioned it before. There's a political idolatry, but it's a particular form of political idolatry whose main whose primary costume is one of aversion, right? Is one of malice. It's who we hate. Political, what is it called? Anti-partisanship, I think is the word. And
Negative partisanship. Yeah.
yeah,
Negative partisanship. Yeah. Alan Abramowitz, a great political scientist, retired from Emory, has done some great work on this. You're right.
yeah.
It's very
So
important. Central force in our politics right now.
So the way that Sarah Palin was talking about them, the political opponent, was the same way that people I was in a Bible study with were talking about them, and the real belief that Christianity is under attack and they're coming, for us, and they, like, have you spoken to any of them? Do you know any of them? So I really that's what's animated me for the better part of 25 years, is that the one of the ways that John Rauch as an activist to get gay marriage passed, state by state and then at the national level, was what you said before, which was, well, if you know someone who's gay, then you have to humanize that person. You have to it's not an issue, a theoretical issue that you're talking about some imaginary adversary, right? It's a person that you have a relationship with. Now we can do some work together, right? So that's really what animates me. I want to figure out how to talk politics and religion without killing each other, because that, more than any other issue, we can't talk about the issues unless we can have the conversation with each other. So that's I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what
That's
came to
really
mind.
helpful. I got to say, the conversation has inspired me to think about two of my favorite observations. One, just on your point about political idolatry, and there's a paraphrase from C.S. Lewis, who wrote that we don't consult Scripture for guidance on how we should think about politics. We ransack Scripture for support for our own political party. People do that, and I think there's a lot of that going around. But I was so grateful that you mentioned Heschel, because Abraham Heschel is one of my heroes too, along with Niebuhr, and I teach both Niebuhr and Heschel. And the line that try to think about almost every day is, well, I don't want to exaggerate, but I think about a lot, is his line that wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge. And I realized that I've thought about that a lot, and saying, is that violating a fundamental rule of contemporary journalism? But I do think that wonder leads you to ask interesting questions, and as to why a lot of things are. And I just love the emphasis that Heschel puts on wonder. And I just want to leave that with you. And I somehow think you share that view.
That's great. I've been talking a lot. A few weeks ago, Monty Guzman from Brave Rangers came back on here. Curiosity is her thing, and one of the outlets that I'm a big fan of, I've become a big fan of in recent weeks, is Tangle, and Isaac Saul, the founder of Tangle, talked a lot about curiosity, but wonder that elevates curiosity to an even
I like that link. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
yeah, I love it.
Um,
So we did cover a lot here, and I know I've kept you a few minutes late. But was there anything important we haven't discussed that you'd like to add?
Probably said enough.
Okay, terrific. I know you have a deadline. So before we go, how can folks find you online and follow all the
Well,
great
they
work that you're
can,
doing?
I write, my central place to write for is the Washington Post. I'm on Twitter at EJ Dionne. I'm on Blue Sky at EJ Dionne dot, whatever comes
Yeah.
after that on Blue Sky. And at the urging of our kids, I am trying to do more forms of social media. So
Okay.
stay tuned.
Terrific, terrific. Well, this was really fantastic. I'm so grateful to have had a chance to talk to you, EJ. And please make sure to thank Max for helping to set this up. He's
Well, it's really great
terrific.
to talk to you.
Yeah.
And let me know when this goes up. I thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show, write those reviews, and now you can watch the conversations on YouTube, support us on Patreon. It's youtube.com/@politicsendreligion. You can find me on all those socials at Corey S. Nathan, Corey S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. Your support really does make a difference, so thank you for all of it. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.